I want you to picture something. You're pulling into a campground after 6-7 hours on the road. You're tired, you gotta use the bathroom. Maybe the dog's whining in the back, and you go to open that RV door and it sticks. Won't budge. You gotta throw your shoulder into it just to get it open. And when you do, it groans like it's mad at you. Sound familiar? If you've owned an RV for more than a summer, I guarantee you've had this happen. And I guarantee at some point, somebody told you it was going to cost you $200 to fix. Well, I'm here to tell you that's a load of nonsense. And today I'm going to show you exactly why that door's sticking, and how you can fix it yourself for about $5 and maybe 20 minutes of your Saturday morning. No dealer, no service department, no waiting 3 weeks for an appointment. Just you, a couple cheap items you probably already have laying around the house, and a little bit of old school know-how. And I know some of you watching this are thinking, Hank, it's not that big a deal, I'll just muscle it open like I always do. But I want you to think about that for a second, because a sticky door isn't just some minor inconvenience. If you've got a grandkid traveling with you who can't shove that door the way you can, or if you're not moving as quick as you used to, and heaven forbid there's ever a night where you need to get out of that rig in a hurry, that door needs to open smooth every single time, not just most of the time. So this isn't only about saving $200, though we're going to get plenty into that. It's about having a door that does its job right, every time, no exceptions. Now, before I get into the fix, let me tell you how I learned this one, because it's a good story and it's going to help you understand exactly what's going on with that door of yours. Years back, I was camped up in the Ozarks with a fella named Roy. Roy had been full-timing longer than I'd even owned a rig, and he had this beat-up old toolbox that looked like it survived a war, dented on every corner, latch held shut with a bungee cord. One morning I come out of my camper cussing up a storm because my door wouldn't shut right, kept catching on something about halfway through, and I was fixing to drive it into town and let the dealer deal with it. Roy was sitting there with his coffee, watching me wrestle with that door, and he just laughed at me. He said, "Hank, you're about to pay somebody $200 to do what I can show you in the time it takes to drink this coffee." I told him he was crazy, that it probably needed a whole new latch. Maybe the frame was bent. He just shook his head, walked over, opened the door slow, watched it for about 10 seconds and said, "It ain't the latch. It's your strike plate, and it's 1/8 of an inch off." Sure enough, he was right, and he was done fixing it before I'd even finished my own cup. That conversation saved me more money over the years than I can even count, because once you understand what actually makes an RV door sticky, you start seeing the same 3 or 4 culprits over and over again, no matter what rig you're in. So let's talk about what's really going on. Because here's the thing dealers don't want you thinking too hard about. An RV door isn't some complicated piece of machinery. It's not like your engine or your electrical system, where you genuinely might need a specialist. A door sticking is almost always one of 3 things, sometimes a combination of all 3. Number 1, the hinges are dry or a little bit out of alignment. Number 2, the strike plate and the latch aren't lining up the way they used to. And number 3, and this one catches people off guard, the door itself has swollen up from moisture and temperature changes. That's it. 3 things. And every single one of them you can handle with stuff sitting in your junk drawer right now. Let's start with the hinges, because that's usually the easiest to check and it's often the actual problem, even when folks assume it's something worse. Open your door nice and slow, and I mean slow like you're sneaking up on something. Watch and listen to what happens right at the hinge side. If you hear that little squeak, or if you can see the door kind of hesitating or catching right where the hinges are, that's your answer right there. RV hinges take a beating. They're out in the weather, they're exposed to dust, road grime, salt if you've been anywhere, near the coast in the winter. And over time that all builds up and dries out whatever lubrication was in there to begin with. The fix here is about as basic as it gets. You want a dry lubricant, not that spray oil that everybody reaches for first, because the oily stuff actually attracts more dust and dirt, and you'll be right back here in a month. What you want is a little bit of powdered graphite, and if you don't have that, a regular old pencil works in a pinch. I'm serious. Rub the graphite from a pencil right into the hinge pin. Work the door back and forth a few times to get it worked in there, and you'll feel the difference almost immediately. If you want to do it right, a small tube of powdered graphite runs you about $3 at any hardware store, and one tube will last you years because you barely use any at a time. Now, if the hinges check out fine and the door's still sticking, move on to the strike plate and the latch. This is the metal piece on the door frame that the latch bolt slides into when you close the door. And here's what happens over time, especially if you tow your rig on rough roads or you've had it sitting through a hard winter. The frame shifts. Just a little. We're talking fractions of an inch here, but that's all it takes. The latch bolt used to slide right into that strike plate smooth as butter, and now it's catching the edge, or it's rubbing against the metal on the way in. And that's what's making you have to shove the door to get it shut, or yank it hard to get it open. This one's a 2-minute fix once you know what you're looking at. Take a look at that strike plate. Most of them have 2 screws holding them in place, and those screws sit in slotted holes, which means you've got a little bit of wiggle room built right in by the manufacturer. All you're doing is loosening those 2 screws, just enough that the plate can move. Then you shift it slightly, maybe 1/8 of an inch one direction or another. Close the door gently to see if it lines up better, and then tighten those screws back down. You might need to do this 2 or 3 times to get it just right, but I want you to notice something. You didn't buy a single new part. You just adjusted what was already there. That's the whole secret dealers don't advertise. Half the time when they charge you for a new latch assembly, they didn't need a new latch assembly at all. They needed to loosen 2 screws and nudge a piece of metal. But a new assembly costs more, and a new assembly means a bigger bill, and that's just good business for them, even if it's not honest business. Now for that third one, and this is the one that trips up even folks who've been RVing a good long while. Sometimes the hinges are fine, the strike plate lines up perfect, and the door is still sticking. And that's because the door itself has actually swollen. This happens more than you'd think, especially with rigs that have any wood framing in that door, or even the fiberglass ones if moisture's gotten in around the edges over the years. Humidity gets into that material, especially if you've been somewhere humid for a stretch, or if the rig sat closed up through a wet spring, and the door expands just enough that it's now a hair too big for the frame it's supposed to slide into. You'll know this is your problem if the door drags along the frame itself, not just at the latch, but all along the edge, especially toward the bottom or the top corners. The fix here takes a little more elbow grease, but it's still cheap and it's still something you do yourself. First thing, you want to find exactly where it's dragging. Take a piece of chalk, or even just a pencil, and run it along the edge of the door frame where you think it's rubbing. Close the door gently, open it back up, and you'll see the chalk mark transferred right onto the spot that's making contact. That tells you exactly where to focus. Now here's where a $5 item comes in that most folks never think to use for this. A plain bar of soap. I mean a bar of ivory soap, the kind that's probably sitting in your bathroom right now. You rub that bar of soap directly onto the spot where the door's been dragging, right onto the frame or the door edge, whichever one's swollen. That soap acts as a dry lubricant, and it lets the door glide right past that tight spot instead of catching on it. Now, if the swelling is bad enough that soap alone isn't cutting it, you can take a piece of fine grit, sandpaper, something like a 200 grit, and very lightly, and I mean very lightly, sand down that high spot you found with the chalk. You're not trying to reshape the door. You're just knocking down that little bit of extra material that's causing the friction. Do a little test the door. Do a little more if you need to. It's always easier to take off more material than it is to put it back on, so patience is your friend here. Now let me say something about where you're camping, because that matters more than folks realize. If you're one of my snowbirds heading down to Arizona or out toward the desert Southwest, you're going to run into a different version of this problem than the folks parked up along the Gulf Coast or out in the Pacific Northwest. Dry heat doesn't swell wood, it shrinks it, and it dries out rubber seals until they crack instead of getting gummy. So if you're in dry country and your door's sticking, it's usually not swelling you're dealing with. It's the opposite. The seal's gotten brittle and it's not sitting flush anymore, which throws off how the door sits in the frame. For that, you want a rubber conditioner, and honestly, a little bit of plain petroleum jelly rubbed into that seal works just fine and costs you next to nothing. Now, if you're camped somewhere humid, down in Florida or Louisiana or anywhere along the water, that's when you get the classic swelling I just walked you through, especially if the rig's been sitting closed up for a stretch. Same door, same basic problem, but two completely different climates causing it. And that's exactly the kind of thing a dealer isn't going to sit there and explain to you. They're just going to quote you a price. While we're on the subject of doors, I want to touch on something a lot of you have probably got and might not have thought about, and that's your screen door. If your rig's got one of those fold-out ones on a track, those things stick just as often as the main door does, maybe more, because that track collects dirt and sand something fierce, especially if you've been camping anywhere near a beach or a dusty campsite. The fix there is even simpler than the main door. Take an old rag, wipe that track down good to get the grit out of it, and then run a little bit of that same candle wax right along the track itself. Slide the door back and forth a few times to work it in. That's it. Most folks think a sticky screen door means the whole track assembly needs replacing, and I've heard of shops charging almost as much for that as they do for the main door latch, when 9 times out of 10 it just needed to be cleaned out and waxed. There's actually a fourth trick that Roy taught me that morning that I want to pass along, because it ties all 3 of these together, and it's the kind of thing that separates a lasting fix from a fix that only holds for a month. Once you've handled whichever of these 3 problems was giving you grief, take a plain candle, the kind you'd use in a hurricane lamp or just a basic household candle, and run the wax along the door seal itself, that rubber gasket that runs around the frame. That wax keeps the rubber from getting tacky and sticking to the door when temperatures swing, which is a huge part of why doors that were working fine in the spring start sticking again come the heat of summer. That gasket gets warm, gets a little gummy, and it grabs onto the door every time you try to open it. A little wax on there and it'll glide instead of grab. That candle probably cost you $1, maybe $2, and it'll last you through fixing every door and window seal on that whole rig. So let's add it up. A tube of graphite, maybe $3. A bar of soap you already own or can grab for under $1. A candle for another $1 or $2. That's your whole toolkit, and you've got change back from a $5 bill. Compare that to what a dealer's going to do. They're going to have you drop the rig off, which means you're without your RV for however many days they're backed up, and that's if you can even get an appointment quick. Then they're going to charge you a diagnostic fee just to look at it, sometimes $40, $50 right off the bat before they've done a single thing. Then, and this is the part that gets me, a lot of shops are going to tell you the whole latch mechanism needs replacing, because replacing a part and charging labor on top of it is a whole lot more profitable than admitting the fix was 2 screws and some elbow grease. Add up the parts, the labor, the diagnostic fee, and you're looking at that $200 real quick, sometimes more depending on where you're at and who you're dealing with. I'm not saying every dealer out there is trying to take advantage of you. Some of them are honest folks doing honest work. But I've been around this business long enough, and I've talked to enough of you good people in the comments and at campgrounds and rallies to know that a sticky door getting turned into a $200 repair bill happens a whole lot more often than it should. And the reason it happens is because most RV owners don't know what I just told you. They don't know it's almost always one of 3 simple things. They just know the door won't open right, and when somebody in a service uniform tells them it needs a new part, they believe it, because why wouldn't they? That's really what this channel's about, if you think about it. It's not that the folks working these RVs today are dumber or less capable than the folks who did it 50 years ago. It's that a whole lot of that everyday knowledge just doesn't get passed down anymore. Used to be, you'd learn this stuff from your dad, Or from the guy camped next to you who'd been doing it 30 years longer, like I learned it from Roy. Nowadays, everybody's in such a hurry, and there's an app or a service department for everything. So that knowledge just doesn't get shared around the campfire the way it used to. I aim to fix that, one video at a time. Now I'll tell you, once you've done this fix, you ought to make it part of your regular routine, not just something you do when the door's already giving you trouble. Every time you do your seasonal walk around before a big trip, after you've had the rig sitting for the winter, take 2 minutes and check those hinges. Check that strike plate. Run your hand along that door seal. Catching a little bit of swelling or a little bit of dryness before it turns into a full-on stuck door is a whole lot easier than fighting with it at 8 o'clock at night trying to get into your rig after a long drive. That's just good old-fashioned maintenance, the kind that keeps you out of the service bay altogether. I want to hear from you on this one. Drop a comment down below and tell me, has a dealer or a shop ever tried to charge you big money for something that turned out to be a simple fix once you figured it out yourself? I read every one of these, and honestly, some of the stories you all share are wilder than mine. It helps everybody else watching too, because the more of us that share what we've learned, the harder it is for anybody to pull a fast one on the next guy. One last thing before I let you go. If you've got a door on your rig that's been sticking for a while now, don't put this off. The longer that swelling sits there, the longer that frame stays out of alignment, the worse it tends to get, especially once real heat or real cold sets in. Go grab that bar of soap, that candle, maybe a pencil if you don't have graphite handy, and give this a shot this week. It's 20 minutes of your time against $200 of somebody else's profit margin. And I know which side of that trade I'd rather be on. I'm Hank Dawson. Thank you for listening to Roadside Wisdom.